Hello everybody, this is MK with MK's class. Today we are finishing the section of Turning Points in South African History, Unit 3. 1990, release of Mandela and the unbanning of liberation movements. Events leading to 1994 election, internal resistance and repression in the 1980s. After the Soweto uprising, many countries turned against South Africa. The government secretly spent millions on propaganda in overseas newspapers to try to create a positive picture of South Africa. Prime Minister John Vorster was forced to resign in 1978 when it was discovered that taxpayers' money was being spent on this. This incident became known as the Information Scandal. P.W. Botha became the next Prime Minister and was faced with many problems: sanctions, boycotts, international isolation, foreign capital leaving the country, black opposition to apartheid increasing, industrial unrest in the form of strikes and stayaways, the collapse of colonial rule in neighboring countries. Botha needed a total strategy for this onslaught. He decided to try to get support by aiming at homeland leaders by pouring money into these areas, middle-class black people by dropping a few petty apartheid laws and allowing them to buy land, offering economic assistance to neighboring countries, provided they did not allow ANC bases in their countries. Botha thought he would get the support of colored people and Indians by allowing them to be part of Parliament. White people still had all the control of major issues, as the Indians and colored people only had a say in their own affairs. This new tricameral Parliament, established in 1983, gave Botha greater powers in his new role of state president. Some Afrikaners were furious with the new reforms. They left the NP to form the Conservative Party led by Andries Treurnig. Indians and colored people also showed their disgust of the so-called reforms, with 70% of them not voting in the election. Church leaders such as Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Dr. Alan Boesak, and the Reverend Beyers Naudé began to call for increased economic sanctions. In 1985, the Congress of South African Trade Unions was formed to unite all the smaller trade unions so that protests could be properly organized. The UDF and COSATU formed the Mass Democratic Movement and started a campaign of civil disobedience. Botha increased the military budget so that the army could go into the townships to control the constant unrest and rioting. A state of emergency was declared on 20 July 1985, through which police were given extensive power. Activists were arrested, political meetings banned, and news censored. It seemed as though South Africa was about to have a civil war. External pressure on the apartheid regime 1980s. There was an enormous amount of external pressure placed on South Africa to change its racist policies. Organizations such as the UN and the Organization of African Unity persuaded its members to enforce sanctions on South Africa. Archbishop Desmond Tutu called on overseas churches to do the same. Here are some examples of how South Africa was affected. Many countries stopped buying South African goods. Some large companies left South Africa. For example, Pepsi, Kodak, Mobil, IBM, BP, Chevrolet, and Xerox. Some airlines refused to fly to South Africa, and some African countries refused to allow South African airplanes to fly over Africa. Some countries stopped South Africans from visiting their country. Here are some more examples of how South Africa was affected. Petrol supplies were limited, so the speed limit was reduced to 90 kilometers per hour. Musicians and other artists, as well as sportsmen and women, were blacklisted if they performed in South Africa. South Africa was expelled from the Olympic Games and isolated from all international sport. As a result, many young people left the country. The internal and external pressures combined made life in South Africa very difficult. The economy was on the verge of collapsing. Afrikaner businessmen and intellectuals secretly met with the ANC leaders in exile to negotiate a peaceful future. They were instrumental in changing the rigid ideas of Afrikaner leaders in Parliament. The end of the Cold War, 1990. In November 1989, State President F.W. de Klerk was encouraged to make drastic reforms. The Berlin Wall had been torn down, a symbolic end to the Cold War and the collapse of communism. He believed that the ANC would be weakened as its financial support would no longer come from the USSR, and that this would give him the upper hand in peace negotiations. The government could no longer claim that South Africa was a stronghold against communism and rely on the support of the USA and the West. Unbanning of political movements in 1990. On 2nd February 1990, South Africa and the world were stunned and thrilled to hear President de Klerk announce that all political parties would be unbanned and that Nelson Mandela would be released from prison. The public gallery in Parliament was crowded, and television cameras relayed the proceedings live to South Africans who had stopped to watch and listen. De Klerk calmly waited while the speaker opened the session with the traditional prayer. Then he walked over to the podium, where his speech was already in place, and began, speaking half in English and half in Afrikaans. I wish to put in plainly that the government has taken a firm decision to release Mr. Mandela unconditionally. I am serious about bringing this matter to finality without delay. In 30 minutes, he had ended apartheid. The ANC and 30 other political parties, including the Communist Party, were unbanned. The death penalty was suspended. The state of emergency was lifted. Trade unions were allowed to function freely. All political prisoners were to be released immediately. Nelson Mandela was to be released on 11 February 1990. Restrictions on political exiles were lifted. De Klerk promised the first fully democratic election in 300 years. A totally new and just constitutional dispensation in which every inhabitant will enjoy equal rights, treatment, and opportunity. The release of Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners in 1990. Millions of people around the world sat glued to their televisions on Sunday, 11 February 1990. At 4:14, Nelson Mandela and his wife Winnie walked out of the Victor Verster prison in Paarl and received an ecstatic welcome from the enormous crowds that had gathered. Free at last after 27 years. Mandela went to the Cape Town City Hall and addressed a dancing, singing crowd of over 50,000. Our march to freedom is irreversible. In the next few days, everyone wanted to see him or interview him, including the international media. He addressed a capacity crowd at the stadium in Soweto. Other long-term prisoners who had been sent to jail with Mandela had been released before him. 1985, Dennis Goldberg. 1987, Governor Mbeki. And October 1989, Walter Sisulu, Raymond Mlangeni, Elias Motsoaledi, Andrew Mlangeni, and Ahmed Kathrada. In April 1990, 50 political prisoners were released from Robben Island. Some 343 other political prisoners went on a hunger strike, also demanding their release from prison. The government would not release them because they had been accused of criminal offences. Negotiations and violence, 1990 to 1994. In the period from 1990 to the 1994 democratic election, civil war nearly broke out in South Africa. It is estimated that about 18,000 people were killed in violent clashes. The world acknowledged that Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk were instrumental in preventing a bloodbath by awarding them the Nobel Peace Prize. Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi, 1928, was the leader of the Inkatha Freedom Party. During the negotiations, many violent clashes took place between the IFP and the ANC in an attempt to gain supporters for the first democratic election. Buthelezi felt that the Zulu king and traditional chiefs should receive a prominent position in the new government. He also felt that his supporters had a right to carry traditional weapons. The PAC refused to take part in the peace negotiations and carried on with their war against white people. Right-wing Afrikaners refused to hand over the country to black people and allow the destruction of the Afrikaner nation. The Conservative Party would not take part in the negotiations. As a result, some Afrikaners formed another party, the Freedom Front, and took part in the negotiations. The Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging, AWB, was a group of radical Afrikaners who were prepared to fight and die to stop apartheid from ending. In June 1993, they stormed the World Trade Center in Kempton Park, where peace meetings were taking place, using an armed tank. The Herstigte Nasionale Partij was another conservative Afrikaner party that refused to take part in any reform discussions. 19 parties met on and off at the World Trade Center in Kempton Park outside Johannesburg from 1991 to 1994. De Klerk was hoping for a power-sharing government where white people could still retain power. After protests, much violence, killings and mass rolling action, it soon became clear that the ANC would settle for nothing less than one person, one vote. The meetings were known as the Convention for a Democratic South Africa. Over the years, the meetings were broken up because of violence. De Klerk accused Mandela of continuing with the armed struggle because MK had not been disbanded. Mandela accused de Klerk of supporting a third force, comprising government police helping the IFP to fight the ANC. When the popular ANC and SACP leader Chris Hani was assassinated on 10 April 1993, Mandela could barely control the black youth who wanted war. Democratic election 1994. Possibly the most important dates in the history of South Africa were 26 to 29 April 1994, when 46 years of apartheid ended. At the last minute, the IFP decided to join the election on 19 April. Thousands of ballot papers had to have the IFP symbol stuck onto them. Hundreds of reporters from all over the world descended on South Africa for what they thought would be the bloodbath of the century. But there was not one violent incident. Queues of black people, white people, colored people and Indians stood peacefully and happily for hours in the baking sun, waiting to cast their votes. The ANC gained 62% of the votes and the NP 20%. Nelson Mandela became the president of the new Rainbow Nation. And we have come to an end of this session. Thank you for watching and most importantly learning. This is MK's class, signing out.